Hello everybody and welcome back. My name's Deborah Hatswell. Thank you very much for joining me today while I share some of the case files from BBR investigations. What I'm going to share with you today is absolutely astounding. This is the case where the UK government imprisoned a 60-foot Manbeast below the Needles military installation, and one man said, "My father saw it." Now, the Needles are two military installations built above the Needle stacks on the Isle of Wight, which guard the west end of the Solent. The Needles, as they're known, were the location of the British Race for Space programme during the Cold War. The old battery was built in 1862 as a defensive fort that was called into action during both World Wars. When the new battery was built, it became a top-secret base for testing rocket missiles. A deep ditch with a retractable bridge was dug into the chalk to protect the facility from ground attack from the island side. In 1885, a tunnel was dug towards the cliff face from the parade grounds. An elevator down to the beach was completed in 1887, and early searchlight experiments were conducted at the site. Now, for all of 4 areas closed off and boarded up, it's still guarded by armed guards 24/7. It's also floodlit and has tight security. Several YouTubers and urban explorers have tried to enter and take video footage at the site, but they are always scared off by the patrols. Locals and visitors have shared strange supernatural experiences in the past, among which are ghostly and disembodied voices, the spirit of a young boy who walks the corridors, and several UFO reports. But what I'm sharing today is far more concerning, if not outstanding, and it may be the reason it's now impossible to visit the lower sections of the base. Shrouded in mystery for decades gives the whole place an odd feel anyway, but the story in its entirety tells us we know very little about what is housed there. The information passed to me is terrifying, to say the least, and it was shared with me by a gentleman named Christian, who was making a report on behalf of his father. And what you will hear is the account in his own words as he shares one of his father's biggest secrets. Christian said, "I'm making this report now as originally my father worked for the government and had to sign the Official Secrets Act, which expired about 20 years ago. But even so, he was very private with the information he held, and he only ever discussed it with me once when I was older. The event itself took place in the late 1970s. I was about 7 at the time. My mother, father and me went on holiday to the Isle of Wight, and I was told it was the Polytechnic College who'd funded the holiday, as my father was a very good photographer. Much later, I found out the holiday was really paid for by one of the universities who'd funded the trip. We had a lovely holiday, and on the second to the last day, my father explained that he had a photography task to complete at the Needles Fort on the edge of the island. This was normal. As I said, my father worked for the government, and he'd worked at times with NASA, and the base there was used for space flight and weapon technology. This many years later. The base was also used for testing the Blue Streak missile, as well as the Black Knight and the Black Arrow satellite launch vehicles. So the idea of him having to work there that day was not out of place. We had an Austin A40 at the time, and by the time we were all in it, along with all of the photography equipment, it was a tight squeeze. I remember my father having these Metz flash guns that were extremely bright and they were made in Germany. He had a square format Hasselblad camera, which he needed for large images. We set off and stopped close to the Needles Fort. My father got out of the car, got his equipment, went across the road to the fort, and myself and my mother stayed in the car. He was gone for a very long time. It was around 4 hours, and he looked really shook up and worried when he finally returned. But he didn't explain anything to us then, and he was quieter than usual for a while after this. It was only many years later, when I was around 16, that he even told me what had taken place that day and why it had such a profound effect on him, even all these years later. He told me what happened and said he'd never have this conversation with me again, and he was adamant that this information wasn't shared with anyone at the time. And this is what he told me. He said when he made it to the base, he was met by a commander-in-chief who was in a very high up position. If I remember correctly, he thought he maybe was the chief of staff. My father was made to sign several documents and was checked by security, and when they were satisfied with him, they took him over to a very large lift. I remember him telling me the lift was so big it was the size of a building, and you could have fitted 9 or 10 lorries within it. My father, the chief of staff, and the armed guards filed into the lift, and then the platform they were standing on began to descend. Slowly at first, but then it gradually picked up speed until it was moving at a pace, so much so the wind was moving his hair and his clothing. The lift went deeper and deeper into the earth, but if you looked up, you could still see the light at the top of the shaft. My father estimated they were moving about 15 to 20 miles an hour, and they did this for over 20 minutes, and he felt they'd probably gone 2.5 miles below the cliff. When the platform finally settled, the man in charge explained to my father that he needed to take some high quality images of something, and he would find it very shocking. And at that point, they left the lift along with the armed guards. They entered into a corridor that had other corridors and rooms leading off from it, and the base itself was vast. There were vehicles down there and people milling around. They escorted him into a huge room, like a cathedral in size, which is mind-blowing, as all of this was underneath the sea. As they walked along, he passed a room that you could see into, but it was in complete darkness. He was then taken into the cathedral-sized room, accompanied by the head guy and all of the armed guards. This room was like a vault, and as they entered through a second set of doors, he was confronted by hundreds of armed men. The chief of staff pointed out a huge cage, in which was a giant beast of some kind, and my father was told to take photographs of it and capture it in its captured state. Now, the commanding officer named the beast, but my father could never remember what that name was. The cage it was sitting in was encased in some kind of special steel bars with the circumference of huge organ pipes. The bars went into the floor and the ceiling of the room and seemed to be about 100 feet tall at its width and was twice the size of its height. There were 2 perimeters between him and the cage, and both were heavily manned. The guard told him he must not attempt to go towards the cage or cross the perimeter at any cost, as they may not be able to save him and they may have to shoot him. As you can imagine, it must have been terrifying, an awful ordeal, but my father had to hold it together, set up his equipment, while thousands of thoughts were racing through his head. What was this thing? How did it get there? How did they build this prison for it? What was housed within the other rooms? And what would happen to him when the photography session was over? My father was horrified, but steeled himself together and set about his task. My father set up as many Metz flashes as he had, while avoiding the gaze of the beast. And when all of the tripods were positioned, he had no choice but to start to take the shots, which meant he had to fully look at it. So that's what he did. What he described in that cage I'll never forget. The commanding officer wanted shots of the beast from as many angles as possible, and then of its feet, legs, body, arms, and face, etc. To do this, my father had to use the flashes, and this upset the creature a great deal. On the first flash, it let out a grunting growl, that then, on the second flash, turned into the sound that maybe a 400 male lions would make if they all roared at once. The floor shook with the sound of it. Slumped in the corner of the cage was a creature not of this world. It looked like a combination of a man, a dog, and a beast. It was hair covered, but its feet were bare and similar to ours. They were the size of maybe in a Volvo estate car, and the skin on the feet was grey and very wrinkled, similar to that of an elephant's skin. It became so distressed at the flashing lights, it pulled itself upright and stood towering over my father at around 60 feet tall. It had the face of a human and a dog, and its canine teeth hung down, and they were large like steel pins, and they resembled tusks, and were a yellowish white in colour. The arms on this thing were like single-decker buses, and it reached out with a hand to touch the bars. My father took the last 6 pictures of its face. It had eyes like tractor tyres, and they glowed bright red. And as my father is a Christian, All he could think of was the passage in the book of the Revelations of the beasts known as the children of the fallen ones, or the Nephilim. It said that these beasts will eat 3/4 of the earth, and only the believers of Christ will survive this event. Seeing this thing raging in a cage with no creature comforts, surrounded by guards and machines, was almost too much to bear. So my father finished his shots and looked over to the commanding chief, and my father was led to a blacked out room. And as he left, he saw a huge curtain on an electric track that slowly covered the bars of the cage. As the creature was forced back into the darkness, it slumped to the floor again, and everything shook as it did so. My father was then asked to hand over all of his images, and when he developed them in a specially prepared dark room, he had to hand them over. They stood with him as he did this, so there was no opportunity to sneak out a single image. And then, with no further words, he was escorted back to the lift platform. My father, the guards, and the chief of staff made their way back up to the fort surface. Something puzzled my father about the guards. He said they didn't seem shocked to see it, or affected by the shaking floors or its roars, as if they were used to this beast and were not seeing it for the first time. They seemed completely unfazed by it. He also saw no door on the cage, so how did they get the creature in there to begin with? Maybe it was sedated, but how could you sedate something of that size? My father never discussed this with me again, and I respected that, and I didn't pry or ask further questions. Christian. I'm really grateful to Christian for contacting me and sharing his father's account. I don't know how Christian's father navigated life after this event. No doubt, working for our government, he will have seen remarkable things. But to see a creature like this, in a base that's not supposed to exist, that is deeper than the second shelf off the Isle of Wight, must have been horrifying. And then, to have to listen to its roars as it screamed at the flashes of light, that'd change a man forever. How do you walk away from an event like this? And how do you hold that secret out of fear for the safety of yourself and your loved ones? Every knock on the door must bring terror. How long has our government known about this? As we know, there are so many hidden bases here in the UK and all across the world. What beings are housed within them that we don't have knowledge of? It was only 30 years earlier that a Manbeast was captured by the army on Dartmoor, and that was taken to an undisclosed location after being sedated in a hospital. Then, not too long ago, a creature like this was seen at Holcombe Army Base, along with the creature seen on Salisbury Plain. Reports of horrifying creatures haunt the northeast coast of the UK, and at each MOD site, there are reports of them being seen by visitors and locals alike. Christian asked how this creature came to be caged there, and something I wondered was, maybe these bases are connected below the land. So it's much easier to move around anything the government considered none of our business. These bases could be interconnected, with many world governments also involved in the capture, imprisonment, and study of these giant beasts. Or was he made by them? A giant super soldier of sorts? A 60-foot beast that could tear you to pieces? Or is this beast of another world, and the metal on those bars is the only thing strong enough to hold it? And what is its connection to a weapons testing site? We've all felt the change. We all know a tipping point is coming, and we're being forced more and more indoors. We are becoming the locked-in society our grandparents sought to free us from. Large swathes of woodland and forested areas are being posted as private and fitted with fences and CCTV. Soon, we won't be able to walk anywhere off camera, as our every move is already tracked by the phone you carry with you always. What are they scared of us seeing or encountering? Or is it already too late?